What would you do if a woman of color, dressed simply, walked into a first-class airport lounge, only to be asked to leave because she didn't look the part? No one asked to see her ticket. No one asked which flight she was on. Just a glance from head to toe, a slight furrow of the brow, followed by a cold, even voice. "This area is reserved for premium guests, ma'am." She didn't react. She didn't scream. She didn't pull out her phone to record. She simply stood up, walked away in silence, leaving behind a room full of judgment. But what the people in that lounge didn't know was that the woman they had just dismissed from their exclusive space was the very person with final approval over a $5 billion investment into the airline itself. In just 12 weeks after that moment, one regional branch was shut down, two senior executives were suspended, and the airport lounge that once pushed her out was renamed after her. The first-class lounge at Northmark Airport, a typical Monday morning, a place where every detail exuded glamour and extravagance. The lights reflected off the polished marble floor so brightly that every footstep echoed like a declaration of power and status. Brown leather chairs, oak-paneled walls, the air thick with cedar wood and luxury cologne. Businessmen in sleek gray suits, Swiss brand watches glinting, neatly packed suitcases gliding silently on smooth wheels. In this place, silence was its own language, and eye contact drew invisible lines between those who belonged and those who shouldn't be here. Into that space stepped a woman of color, nearly shattering the entire unspoken arrangement. She wore a light blue cotton shirt, plain khaki pants, unbranded shoes, her hair tied in a neat bun, pulling a worn-out fabric suitcase with frayed corners and faded sticky notes. No Rolex, no Fendi sunglasses, no Louis Vuitton bag. She didn't glance around for validation. She simply wheeled her suitcase to the front desk, presented a QR code from her phone calmly, and spoke in a gentle tone. Not loud, not soft, just clear enough for the staff to hear. "First class, Celeste Monroe." The young receptionist paused briefly, glanced at the ticket scanner, then back at the woman's face. In that brief moment, she said nothing, simply nodded and invited Celeste into the priority lounge. But the nod wasn't quick enough to escape the notice of someone behind the surveillance counter. Connie Walden, head of internal security at the airport. Connie was a white woman in her 50s, stocky build, short blonde hair, and eyes like X-rays. She stood on a raised platform monitoring cameras, surveying everything as if all was under her command. To her, every first-class passenger had to fit the mold: polished, clean, expensive, and preferably in neutral tones. And Celeste, in Connie's eyes, wasn't just different, she was a threat. Celeste entered the lounge like someone used to being watched. She chose a seat near the glass wall, set her suitcase by her feet, pulled out her phone and earbuds, and sat upright. Legs uncrossed, head held high. She stared toward the runway, gaze distant, composed in a way that seemed almost deliberate in ignoring the subtle glances around her. Middle-aged men in tailored suits, women with highlighted hair clutching Chanel bags like talismans. Each one glanced her way, some whispering just loud enough to reach an attentive ear. Is she lost? She looks more like staff than a first-class passenger. Maybe a last-minute upgrade. Celeste had heard it all before, more than once. Nearby, a young flight attendant named April was serving guests. She glanced at Celeste. For a second, her eyes hesitated. Something unsettled her. She couldn't quite name the feeling. Celeste didn't resemble the wealthy travelers she was used to here. But something in the way that woman sat, the stillness radiating from her, made April pause. She glanced at the overhead camera, saw Connie staring fixedly at Celeste with an unmistakable expression of irritation. "Unit 2, priority lounge subject. Dispatch someone to verify ticket status. Possible upgrade scam," Connie said into the radio. Her voice wasn't loud but cold and decisive. A young male staffer in a silver-gray uniform emerged from the back corridor, walking toward Celeste, his eyes scanning swiftly as if looking for a reason to initiate conversation. Celeste didn't look up. She wore her earbuds, eyes still locked on the runway, posture as straight as a soldier's, hand gripping her phone. As the staffer approached, she removed one earbud before he could speak. "Excuse me, Ms. Monroe. We need to recheck your ticket information. Could you provide additional ID, please? Celeste showed no sign of confusion or surprise. She placed her phone on the table, retrieved her wallet from her coat pocket, pulled out a driver's license, and handed it over wordlessly. Her eyes met the staffer's, not aggressively, but with such clarity that it made him tense. He glanced at it, nodded in thanks, and withdrew with visible discomfort. From afar, Connie frowned. She found no errors. Name, photo, ticket number, flight route, all valid. But her instincts, or rather her bias, refused to back down. She barked into the radio, "Proceed to step 2, verbal engagement. Ask for trip purpose and reason for priority lounge access." Minutes later, a female employee approached, attempting to sound courteous. "Excuse me, Miss Monroe. This is part of standard security procedure. We need to verify the purpose of your trip. Could you confirm your travel reason and why you're using a first-class ticket?" For the first time, Celeste looked directly at the corner camera, where Connie stood. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply replied evenly, "I'm flying to Seattle for work, and I have a first-class ticket because I purchased a first-class ticket." The answer was so brief it brought the room to a halt. The employee nodded awkwardly, unsure what else to say. A few people in the lounge began sensing something was off. Some glanced at their phones, pretending not to notice. But one person still stared at Celeste. Connie Walden. In Connie's mind, someone like Celeste couldn't enter this space without being questioned. She didn't fit. She wasn't from this world. Every rule Connie had upheld over 15 years in security was being challenged by Celeste's silence. She stepped out from the control room, marched down the corridor, heading straight towards Celeste like a cold blade approaching an open wound. Upon arrival, she paused, glanced at the digital ticket on the table, then at Celeste's face. Celeste had removed both earbuds. Connie leaned down and whispered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "You're in the wrong place. Economy's over there." Celeste turned her head slowly, very slowly. She said nothing for 3 full seconds, letting the insult hang in the air of luxury. Then she smiled, not a patient smile, not a fake one, but the calm smile of someone who knew exactly where she was and why she was there. "I know where I am," Celeste replied. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but it had more weight than any rebuttal. Connie paused, a breath slightly out of rhythm. She glanced around at the now watching passengers. Without another word, she turned and walked away, lips pressed tight like someone swallowing their anger. From a far corner, April, the young attendant, had seen it all. She hesitated, then walked toward Celeste. As she passed, she gently placed a tissue on the table. Underneath it, a small note written in pen. "They always do this. I'm sorry." Celeste read it without lifting her head, then tucked the note into her jacket pocket, eyes still on the runway, where planes rolled slowly across the tarmac, while somewhere, a system had just started to shake. A few minutes after Connie Walden turned her back on where Celeste was seated, the lounge remained wrapped in the artificial quiet typical of places built for the elite. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a relaxed silence, but a thick, charged stillness, where each glance carried an unspoken question, a silent accusation, or a vague unease that someone had just broken the order that had gone unquestioned for years. Celeste Monroe was still sitting exactly where she was before, her upright posture unchanged, eyes fixed on the distant runway, as if this small, curated world had nothing to do with her. Her earbuds had long been removed, her phone placed face down on her left thigh, and the digital ticket still open on the screen, like a quiet symbol of something many in that room were not ready to accept. She belonged here. She wasn't out of place. But to those who believed that belonging was measured by handbag brands or skin tone, something about Celeste's presence unsettled them. A gray-haired man in a navy suit and shiny Italian leather shoes, sitting 3 seats away, glanced at Celeste for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. He didn't bother to hide it. When Celeste's eyes briefly met his, he immediately looked down and pretended to check his phone, his finger swiping with no clear purpose. Beside him, a woman in Prada glasses leaned slightly, whispering something into the man's ear. Both of them glanced back at Celeste, then lowered their heads with a faint smile. No one said a word, but their body language spoke louder than any sentence. "You don't belong here." April, the young attendant who had left Celeste the note, returned to her station behind the service counter, where she was quietly called back by Connie with a sharp breath. "Back to position," Connie said without looking at her, eyes still fixed on the surveillance feed. "And don't get too friendly with unverified individuals." Her voice was flat, but every word landed with a cold, metallic stamp, intent on control. April nodded obediently, but something within her was uneasy. That little note she left, that one action, now felt like a weight in her chest. She didn't know if she was being watched, but she knew one thing for sure. Connie had noticed. And in this system, if Connie noticed you, trouble had already begun. At the security station down the corridor behind the lounge, a group of staff monitored the room through wide-angle cameras. One of them, Max, a man in his 40s, Latino, whispered to a colleague, "She's doing it again." His coworker said nothing, only shrugged. Max looked at the screen, where Connie was ordering another staffer to recheck Celeste's itinerary, ticket, departure point, and ID. "Everything checks out," the staffer replied. "Nothing unusual." Connie said nothing in return. She only narrowed her eyes as if calculating her next move, then turned back toward the central control room. Inside the lounge, Celeste stood up. Not quickly, not slowly. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the bar to get a glass of water. Those seated nearby shifted slightly, as if her movement had disrupted their balance. Behind the counter, a young white bartender named Luke looked at her with slight hesitation. "Sparkling or still?" he asked. "Still, please," Celeste replied. Luke poured the water, his hand trembling just slightly. He didn't understand why. The woman was perfectly polite, but something in the glances from others around made him feel that being too kind might get him judged. Celeste received the glass, nodded in thanks, and returned to her seat. She understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't the first time, and likely wouldn't be the last. The unwritten rules of first class still echoed through every space like invisible barbed wire. Dress a certain way, sit a certain way, speak a certain tone, and above all, look like everyone else. She had broken those rules many times, but each time someone still believed she needed to be reminded. Down in the administrative floor, a short meeting was underway between Connie and a senior representative of Skyreach Airlines, Mr. Hamilton York. He had just flown in from New York that morning and had no idea what had been unfolding in the first-class lounge. Connie met him in a private meeting room, carrying a printed report listing suspicious behaviors. She listed them off. The passenger didn't fit the expected profile, seemed evasive about her trip's purpose, carried luggage inconsistent with her class of travel, and declined deeper inspection. Hamilton listened, furrowing his brow. "You said she confirmed her identity and itinerary?" "Yes." "Valid ticket?" "Correct." "Then, the suspicion is based on what?" Connie hesitated slightly. "Intuition," she replied. Hamilton was clearly displeased, but he didn't want to challenge Connie either, someone who had jurisdiction over the airport's internal security system. He simply said, "I'll keep observing." Back in the lounge, Celeste checked the time. Her flight was scheduled to depart in just over an hour. She opened her phone and reviewed a few internal emails, all related to Skyreach Airlines, the airline currently under review by Cypress Gate Capital for a potential strategic bailout worth up to $4.9 billion. But like every deal of this magnitude, the disbursement depended on a minimum ethical rating, from customer service to executive conduct. And what no one at the airport knew was that the woman under surveillance was the very person holding the pen that would determine the fate of the entire airline. Celeste knew that if she had shown up with a Prada bag, Tiffany jewelry, and a platinum card with her firm's name printed on it, things would have played out very differently. But she hadn't come here for special treatment. She came to see the truth, a very old truth, a deeply rooted culture, a metric of human worth not based on character, but on appearance. She noticed it in every glance employees avoided, every muttered customer comment, every warped procedure justified to disguise discrimination. And she knew the system still operated on a flawed, unwritten logic, where anyone who looked different could never be assumed to belong. As the announcement came over the speaker for Flight 617 to Seattle, notifying first-class passengers to prepare for boarding, Celeste Monroe stood up, adjusted the handle of her suitcase, and walked toward the priority gate. Her stride was not hurried, nor did it seek to assert anything. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she stood, but also understood perfectly the space she was about to enter. A gateway not just into the aircraft cabin, but the final testing ground for a system waiting to reveal its true nature. Connie Walden was already at the boarding area before any passengers were invited to line up. She stood with two security officers, both dressed in silver-gray uniforms, their expressions cold as scanners. One was a tall white man with a military-bearing build. The other, a Hispanic male, smaller but with eyes sharp as blades. Connie didn't bother hiding her posture anymore. When she saw Celeste approaching the gate, she made a short hand signal. A wordless point, but clear as a command. The two men stepped forward and blocked Celeste's path. "Ma'am," the white officer said in a firm but controlled tone, "we need you to step aside with us for a standard verification process." Celeste stopped, eyes forward, showing no sign of surprise. "On what grounds?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, nor confrontational, but it was so clear and measured that all three men felt a strange pressure building in the air. "We've had an internal alert," the man replied, avoiding the direct question. "Just a routine security screening. Please follow us." Celeste glanced toward the boarding door just a few meters ahead, where a few first-class passengers were already walking through, unchallenged. She nodded. "Lead the way." They escorted her down a side hallway, turned left through two separate doors that required individual scans, then stopped in front of an ivory-colored door with no nameplate. One of the officers scanned a badge. The door clicked open, revealing a small room. White painted walls, cold fluorescent lights overhead, a metal table, and two gray plastic chairs. No visible cameras, no windows. An ivory room, just as the security staff called it. The kind of place ordinary people never saw, but which held the power to decide who was allowed to proceed. Celeste stepped inside without waiting to be asked. She rolled her suitcase next to her leg, sat down on one side of the table, her back straight, both hands resting gently on her thighs. The two men stood across from her for a few seconds before the Hispanic officer pulled out a notebook and began with the same tired script. "What is your full name?" "Celeste Monroe." "What is the purpose of your flight today?" "Business." "Can you elaborate on the nature of your business?" "No." The man frowned. "No. I'm not obligated to disclose business details unless there is a specific legal reason. This is not a customs checkpoint, and I have passed TSA and ID verification. If there is something more serious involved, I'd like a lawyer present." Her answer dropped a heavy silence over the room. The other man, who had remained quiet until now, pressed a button on the radio. A female voice responded. It was unmistakably Connie Walden. "Hold her. I'll be there in 2 minutes." Celeste heard this. She looked directly at the officer who had pressed the call. "Just to be clear, am I being detained or questioned?" He didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "You're under routine secondary screening." Celeste curled her lips slightly. Not quite a smile. She opened her suitcase, took out a small laptop bag, and placed it on the table. She also retrieved a large cream envelope sealed with red wax bearing the logo of Cypress Gate Capital. The younger officer looked at the envelope, tilting his head. "What's in that?" "Documents," Celeste replied. "Confidential corporate files. Access restricted by legal statute. We'll need to inspect that." He reached for it. Before his hand touched the envelope, Celeste calmly raised her hand, not touching him, but creating a clear line. "You'll need a court order and an attorney present to unseal that document. Otherwise, it's unlawful." The two men looked at each other. For the first time, they were uneasy. This wasn't like the screenings they were used to, where travelers panicked, got angry, or fearful. This woman showed no emotion, no raised voice, but each of her sentences landed like a nail driven into the table. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed knowledge and complete composure. The door swung open. Connie stepped in without acknowledging the two officers. She looked straight at Celeste like a hawk sighting prey. "Miss Monroe," she said, "we've had concerns about your status." "Your concerns," Celeste replied, "are clearly not grounded in any policy I'm aware of. You don't look like someone who usually travels first class." That sentence, delivered softly, Was the nail sealing the box? Celeste paused for 2 seconds. And what does someone like that look like? Connie didn't answer. Celeste held her gaze unblinking. You've checked my ID. You've seen my ticket. You've searched my bag. What exactly are you looking for? There was no answer, but Connie signaled to the standing officer. File the incident. Mark her as non-cooperative. Celeste gave a soft laugh, as if what she'd heard was a bad joke. Non-cooperative because I asked for due process? Because you're evasive, Connie snapped, and you're using language to obscure your intentions. Celeste shook her head. You don't need to know my intentions. This isn't your courtroom. No one spoke, but the ticking of the clock in the room now sounded like a soundtrack to something about to break. Celeste stood up. If we're done, I'd like to board my flight now, unless you plan to escalate this into a legal incident. Connie didn't speak, but the officer nodded. You're clear to go, he said, voice lower than before. Celeste gave a subtle nod. She packed her laptop, collected the envelope, pulled her suitcase, and exited the ivory-colored room at a steady pace, as if she knew she had just walked through something very old, very narrow, and deeply unjust, but still standing. And she wasn't surprised. She had expected this, because today's entire trip, this whole journey, was never just a business flight. This was an investigation, and she was the one entrusted with the final scorecard. When Celeste Monroe returned to the lounge after the cold interrogation in the ivory room, none of the passengers sipping wine or tapping away on their MacBooks had any idea what had just taken place behind that sealed door. They only saw a woman of color walking out with her posture straight, her gaze steady, her face calm, and that alone made people either curious, uncomfortable, or vaguely afraid without knowing why. She didn't look offended. She wasn't shaken like someone who had just been humiliated. She simply returned to the same seat, placed her suitcase by the right side, opened her phone, and did one simple thing. She logged into Cypress Gate Capital's secure internal system, accessed a special category labeled Level 3 Ethics Audit, and pressed the button. Mark Incident Escalated. No sound. No one around noticed. But from that very moment, a series of protocols began to activate. Protocols that neither Connie Walden nor any staff member at Northmark International had any idea were in motion. And more importantly, every one of them centered around the woman they believed didn't belong here. Celeste was not an ordinary passenger. She was the Senior Director of Ethics and Compliance at Cypress Gate, a powerful strategic investment firm with deep influence in the civil aviation industry. And more than that, she was the architect of the ethics evaluation criteria used to audit all partners currently under financial bailout negotiations. Skyreach Airlines, the airline for which Northmark served as a central operational hub, was relying on an investment package of nearly $5 billion to stay out of bankruptcy. What they didn't know was that today, the person silently assessing them was the same woman who held the pen that could sign their future into existence or erase it completely. And the first item she logged in her internal report was presence questioned for unofficial reasons, screening protocol misused, subject subjected to indirect discrimination through instinctive bias. Celeste hadn't taken on this evaluation personally due to a lack of staff. For years, she had led undercover audits using other people, trained actors, anonymous guests, or regular passengers under light surveillance. But this time, she chose to appear in person, for a very personal reason. Nearly 3 decades ago, in this very airport, she had worked as a janitor while attending college. Night shifts from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., cleaning the women's restrooms in Section C, just a few hundred feet from the first-class lounge. Once, she had been scolded by a manager for entering the VIP section to collect trash, simply because she didn't look the part. No apology followed. No inquiry was ever made. No one thought that she, the quiet worker who didn't cause trouble, deserved to be treated with respect. And today, 30 years later, she returned, not to reclaim old dignity, but to see whether the system had changed at all. Silence can be a weapon if you know how to wield it. And Celeste knew. She didn't need to confront Connie in public. She didn't need to shout or film a video for social media. She only needed to record, meticulously, accurately, and submit it through the right internal channel, where just 3 confirmed lines could trigger an audit across the entire network. What Connie and her security team didn't know was that every time they radioed a command, every time they printed a verification slip, every entry into the screening system was being logged. Celeste carried a small device, a hidden microphone with a discreet built-in camera embedded into the strap of her fabric tote. It didn't transmit in real time, but it captured everything: expressions, voices, tone, posture, every nuance of those involved. Celeste didn't need evidence to win an argument. She needed evidence to define culture, so that when the airline asked, "Why weren't we approved for financial support?" she could point to the video and say, "Because this isn't a financial issue. This is a systemic character failure." Seated again, Celeste continued to flag 3 key observations. 1. Bias at security checkpoint. 2. Improper escalation without probable cause. 3. Supervisory interference rooted in appearance-based assumptions. Each point had a unique code and would be handled by an internal audit team within 24 hours. She knew the process. She had written it herself. A senior executive at Skyreach's airport operations, Mr. Lance Frederick, had just received a coded email from Cyprus. The first line made him gasp. "Live ethics audit currently underway at Northmark Hub. High-level anomaly detected." Lance had no idea who was conducting the audit. No one had given prior notice, and that was precisely how Celeste wanted it. No warning, no staging, no performance. True ethics only appear when no one thinks they're being watched. Back in the administrative zone, Connie returned to the main control room, her gaze unsettled. She said nothing to anyone about what had just taken place in the ivory room. But something inside her now made her impatient. She had expected the woman to get angry, to react, or reveal a weakness. But all Celeste did was speak as if Connie had no authority over her. That composure made Connie feel out of control, and for someone like her, that was worse than being reprimanded. "She's up to something," Connie muttered, then pressed the internal call button. "Monitor passenger Monroe. I want eyes on her until she boards. No deviation." But no one, not even Connie, could see what was truly unfolding. Celeste wasn't getting ready to leave. She was preparing to change the entire framework by which this airport measured service quality, and she wasn't doing it alone. Under Cyprus's encryption system, 5 human resources specialists, 2 coordinating attorneys, and 3 scenario analysts had already received her report. An entire audit engine was in motion, quiet, invisible, all triggered by the way one woman had been made to feel out of place. She knew those glances would never disappear. She hadn't come here to change other people through outrage. She came to prove one singular truth. When a system misjudges someone, not from lack of information, but from lack of respect, that system will eventually be held accountable. Celeste glanced at the blinking board. Skyreach Flight 617. Now boarding first class. She stood up, neither faster nor slower than before. She walked toward the gate with the stride of a woman nobody knew, but whom everyone would remember. Celeste Monroe stepped through the boarding door without a flicker of hesitation. Her eyes didn't dart around, nor did they seek any sympathetic gaze. She didn't need it. Those watching, airport staff, trailing passengers, only saw a simply dressed black woman walk directly into the first-class cabin without looking back, showing not the slightest trace of unease. But if anyone were sharp enough to study her expression closely, they'd realize she wasn't entering as a passenger. She was turning the next page of an unfinished dossier. The plane carried nearly 200 people, but perhaps only one knew that this flight was also carrying the moral weight of an entire airline. And that person was her. As Celeste entered first class, there was no warm smile waiting. Instead, there was a flicker of confusion in the eyes of the flight attendant standing near the door. A blonde woman with her hair in a tight bun, her uniform pristine, name tag clearly visible, Delaney Walden. Delaney was the lead flight attendant for the trip, known internally at Skyreach for being professional but strict, and few knew she was the niece of Connie Walden. Like Connie, Delaney judged passengers not by their ticket, but by the exterior they wore. And Celeste, in Delaney's eyes, was immediately classified as someone who disrupts brand experience. Delaney said nothing as Celeste entered. She turned away and resumed neatly arranging napkins on trays, as if the woman who had just boarded didn't exist. Another flight attendant, a young man named Josh, glanced at Celeste and was about to greet her, but upon catching Delaney's subtle look, he stayed silent. A chill settled over a cabin designed to feel luxuriously warm. Celeste scanned the space. Most passengers were middle-aged men in tailored suits, women in cashmere jackets or designer suits. No one smiled. A few glanced at her, then turned away, as though her presence posed an unanswerable question or a provocation. She walked to seat 2A, a window seat just a few meters from the cockpit. She carefully placed her suitcase in the overhead bin, sat down and fastened her seatbelt. No one offered assistance. No welcome drink, no hot towel. Meanwhile, another passenger, a white man in his early 50s, tall, lean, dressed in a gray suit and flashing a bright Rolex, boarded the cabin less than a minute after Celeste and was immediately greeted by Delaney with a slight bow, a towel, and an offer of orange juice. He smiled, responded warmly. Delaney returned the smile, her tone honeyed. "Let us know if you need anything at all, Mr. Durant." That man sat in seat 2B, right next to Celeste. When he noticed her, the smile on his face disappeared. He looked her up and down, exhaled sharply through his nose and shrugged. No words needed, just a posture. About 5 minutes later, as passengers settled in and the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Delaney walked the aisle for a final check. She passed Celeste without a word. When she reached row 3, she turned back and looked at Celeste with a gaze that bordered on command. "Please make sure your phone is in airplane mode," she said. Celeste picked up her phone, toggled the signal off, and nodded. "Already done," she replied. Delaney said nothing and walked on. The man beside her, Durant, gave a dry chuckle and said just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "Looks like they'll let just about anyone into first class these days, huh?" Celeste turned, locking eyes with him. Her smile wasn't cordial. It was a challenge to the silence he was hiding behind. "Do you really think money alone earns you a place like this?" she asked, not loud, but heavy with intent. Durant froze. He didn't respond. He looked forward, silent as though caught in the act. From the front of the cabin, Delaney glanced back. She saw Durant turn his head, and Celeste sitting quietly, still smiling. But inside Delaney, a faint unease began to stir. She didn't like directness, especially from someone she had already decided should remain silent. The aircraft picked up speed. The engines roared like a drum roll before a curtain rises. And on that stage, at 35,000 feet, a small performance with enormous meaning had begun. Delaney returned to her seat and opened the internal tablet. She checked the passenger list. Celeste Monroe, first class ticket, confirmed reservation, status, not flagged. But the name didn't match anyone she'd encountered before. No public record, no obvious social media trail, no VIP profile like their frequent flyers. She marked a private note into the system. Passenger 2A, potential upgrade case, investigate for reward abuse. Josh, the male attendant, happened to walk past and saw her type the note. "Is that really necessary?" he asked. Delaney didn't answer. She just hit save and locked the tablet. In her seat, Celeste remained silent. She made no visible notes. She didn't react to looks or words. But every moment was being recorded. A tiny camera, hidden beneath her collar, with enough battery for 10 hours, clear audio, high-resolution video. Every word from Delaney, every glance from Durant, every act of selective service was being captured for the internal system. She wasn't recording to expose individuals. She was recording to reveal a system, one where hospitality culture wasn't built to elevate every guest, but to preserve quiet bias. A soft ding signaled that passengers could now remove their seatbelts. Delaney appeared again, pushing the drink cart down the aisle. At row 1, she stopped to ask detailed beverage preferences, offering wines tailored to each guest. At seat 2B, where Durant sat, she leaned in sweetly. "Would you like your usual scotch, Mr. Durant?" He nodded, not glancing sideways. When the cart reached Celeste's row, Delaney said nothing. She simply pushed the cart past. Celeste watched, no anger, no surprise. She pulled out her phone, opened the encrypted app, selected log, intentional service omission. Time, 10:17 a.m. Entry: first-class beverage service intentionally denied, based on appearance, not policy. She saved the note and locked the phone. Outside the window, the clouds drifted like velvet curtains in motion. A quiet play was unfolding in the peaceful sky, a stage with no audience, but real consequences. And the actors, whether aware or not, were steadily leading their system toward the edge. 1 hour after takeoff, Flight 617 was cruising steadily at 37,000 feet, gliding through a calm layer of clouds like an endless white velvet sheet. The first-class cabin of Skyreach Airlines was soaked in a performative serenity. Passengers read newspapers, tapped on iPads, or rested with their eyes closed. But this quiet, like the still surface of a lake before a storm, was hiding an increasingly volatile current. And at the center of it all, as always, was the woman in seat 2A, Celeste Monroe. Celeste wasn't doing anything remarkable. She simply sat in silence, reading documents on her tablet, not speaking, not reacting. Yet her quiet presence somehow unsettled people more than a demanding or complaining passenger ever could. It was a kind of silence that couldn't be dismissed, a confidence that didn't come from appearance, but from knowing exactly who one is. And that alone disrupted a system designed to enforce rules based on surface traits. Delaney Walden, the lead flight attendant, was growing restless. She had deliberately avoided serving Celeste, purposefully ignored her, but the passenger still didn't react. She didn't seem insulted. She made no requests, no complaints. That silence, which Delaney thought would assert control, only made her feel increasingly powerless. In her mind, someone like Celeste, with such an ordinary look, no visible luxury brands, should understand that she was only accidentally in this cabin, perhaps due to reward miles or a promotional upgrade. And people like that were expected to know their place. But Celeste did not behave that way. She didn't retreat, nor did she advance. She simply existed firmly, like a test the system hadn't prepared for. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Delaney decided to draw the line more clearly. She picked up her radio and whispered to a male flight attendant in the economy section. "Have a seat ready in the rear cabin. I need to reassign a passenger. Reason? Weight distribution." Josh, the attendant on the other end, hesitated for a moment. He knew exactly who she was referring to, and he also knew weight distribution was a technically valid reason, but also one conveniently used to handle sensitive cases without public explanation. He wanted to ask why, but understood his position. "Copy," he replied briefly. Delaney walked into the first-class cabin, wearing a polite but insincere smile. She stopped beside Celeste, not bending down, and spoke just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Miss Monroe, for safety and weight distribution purposes, we're going to need to reseat you to the rear cabin." Celeste looked up, set her tablet down, and stared directly at Delaney. For 2 full seconds, she said nothing. Her eyes seemed to search for something not in the words, but in how those words were deliberately chosen. Then she asked, each word enunciated clearly, "Why am I the only one being asked to move?" No anger, no drama, just a simple question. And in that moment, the air in the cabin froze. Delaney blinked, thrown off for a split second, then replied, "It's just standard procedure. Your cooperation is appreciated." But in her voice, hospitality had decayed into command, and professionalism had dropped into defensiveness. Durant, the man seated next to Celeste, raised an eyebrow. A passenger in row 3 turned to look. Others pretended not to hear, but it was obvious everyone was listening, because they knew such a request was extremely rare in first class, and when it happened, it often carried something unspoken. Celeste didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the seat pocket, pulled out her phone, opened the secure internal app, and typed 3 lines. Level 3 active escalation. First-class passenger targeted for reassignment under false operational pretext. Triggering review. Then she set the phone down on the tray table, her eyes never leaving Delaney, and said in a low, steady voice, "If your concern truly is weight distribution, perhaps the issue isn't my seat." Delaney froze. She had no script for this moment. She expected this woman to reluctantly stand up, to leave with a quiet grumble, like most people who don't want to cause a scene. But no. Celeste didn't fall into the trap. She didn't rise. She asked a question. And worse, she asked it so precisely that no one could argue. No one laughed. No one applauded. But in the eyes around her, Delaney realized she had just lost something intangible. An unspoken consensus among passengers. A traveler in row 1 glanced at her, then looked away, as if dodging a conversation that should never have happened here. Josh, from the back of the cabin, quietly sent a message through the internal system. Situation escalating beyond control. Delaney said nothing else. She gave a curt nod and turned away. But everyone in first class knew what had just occurred. A request to move, masked under the guise of safety, had just been unraveled by a single question. Why just me? Celeste said nothing more. She didn't need to. She knew in that moment everything had been recorded. Everything had begun moving. And when a system is pushed to the edge of its ethics, not by shouting, but by asking the right question, what follows is no longer control. It's collapse. As Flight 617 continued gliding through the peaceful sky, no one in the first-class cabin, not even lead attendant Delaney Walden or the passengers relaxing after a light meal, realized they had just witnessed a turning point. Not because the black woman in seat 2A refused to move, but because, with one simple question, why just me? She had pierced the professional veneer this system prided itself on, the illusion of equality. And once that layer cracked, everything buried beneath began to surface. Delaney stormed back to the business class galley, gripping the internal tablet tightly. She couldn't believe that someone like Celeste had managed to shift the entire cabin dynamic with a single sentence. She had intended to deliver a soft lesson, but what she got in return was a response so sharp, so poised, she couldn't find a way to retaliate without exposing her own intent. Back in the cabin, passengers were looking at her differently. No one said a word, but the glances, the awkward averted eyes when they met hers. They all said one thing. They knew. In row 2, Celeste remained in place, still holding her phone. She opened a private interface in the Cypress Gate Capital internal system, a portal reserved for emergency-level evaluations, and entered a Level 2 encrypted command. Trigger provisional freeze notice, internal audit moving to live status. An encrypted email was instantly dispatched to Cyprus's strategic leadership team in New York, warning of a potential freeze on the $4.9 billion deal currently under final review with Skyreach Airlines. A pause button had been pressed, and the people who thought they were merely handling an uncooperative passenger had just thrown a survival-critical deal into red alert. Inside the cabin, Celeste didn't look at Delaney. She didn't look at Durant, the man who had once belittled her with a smug remark. She simply stared out the window, where the white clouds streamed backward beneath the wing as if nothing had happened. But inside, everything was unfolding exactly as she had anticipated. They would push, they would test the boundary, and when they did, she wouldn't need to argue, scream, or record a video. They would write their own failure report with every move they made. Delaney returned to the first-class cabin with a strained smile, trying to restore normalcy. She handed out hot towels to passengers who hadn't received them, made small talk with a couple in row 4, and cast a quick glance toward seat 2A. Celeste didn't look back, but the passenger in row 3, a white woman in a black suit, her blonde curls framed neatly, looked at Delaney with a skeptical gaze. In that brief eye contact, Delaney understood. They had seen. She was no longer in control of the narrative. The flight began its descent. The captain announced they would be landing in 25 minutes. Attendants moved through the aisles collecting items and reminding guests to fasten their seatbelts. The air in the cabin was thick with a quiet tension. No one spoke of it, but everyone sensed that something unusual had taken place and was still quietly unfolding. When the plane touched down at Seattle International, a special ground crew had already been deployed to the gate, not for technical assistance, but to meet someone by special request from the airline's New York headquarters. That person was Celeste Monroe. Delaney received the notice on her tablet just before the aircraft came to a full stop. An internal message from the flight coordinator read, "Passenger 2A to be escorted post-landing. Flag for compliance follow-up." A faint sense of vindication bloomed in her chest. She thought perhaps she had finally proven that the woman was a troublemaker. What she didn't know was this. Celeste was the one who had initiated the entire chain of events. The plane stopped. As the door opened, Delaney gestured for the first-class passengers to disembark in order. Celeste didn't rush. She stood, retrieved her suitcase, and walked toward the door with absolute composure. Waiting at the aircraft door was a man in a gray suit, wearing a badge that read, Elliot D. Kane, Executive Liaison Officer, Skyreach Airlines. Beside him stood an airport security officer and a female representative from the FAA. Mr. Kane stepped forward and said quietly, Miss Monroe, may I ask you to come with us to the conference room? Celeste nodded. Of course. Durant, standing behind her, watched the scene unfold. He assumed Celeste was being taken aside for some kind of violation. He smirked, but within hours he would come to understand that what he witnessed wasn't the removal of a disruptive passenger. It was the opening act of an ethics review that could bring an entire airline to its knees. Delaney watched as Celeste disappeared down the airport corridor, then turned back into the cabin, muttering to herself, "Who does she think she is?" But deep down she knew. The tightness in her chest didn't lie. Something had broken, and it wasn't the woman in seat 2A. It was in the way she herself had chosen to behave. The door to the third-floor conference room at Seattle International Airport closed with a soft click, so subtle that almost no one noticed. But for those inside that room, a room just spacious enough, its soundproofed walls and recessed lighting creating a subdued atmosphere, with a long walnut meeting table. This wasn't merely the closing of a space. It was the opening act of a disruption that no one in the American airline industry could have foreseen. Seated at the head of the table was Elliot D. Kane, Senior Executive Liaison for Skyreach Airlines. To his right were two representatives from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. To his left, Sarah Monroe, Head of Regional Legal Affairs. At the far end of the table, 12 paces from Kane, sat the woman who had shaken Skyreach's entire internal infrastructure in less than 12 hours, Celeste Monroe. The woman who had sat silently in seat 2A, made no demands and uttered no threats, only left behind a trail of subtle signals and deliberate actions that now required everyone present to explain themselves. Delaney Walden, lead attendant of Flight 617, sat at the edge of the table, her face pale, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She still didn't know the exact reason for her summons, but something deep in her gut told her this wasn't a routine internal reminder or a clarification procedure. The presence of the FAA meant the federal level was involved, and when the feds stepped in, the airline was no longer in control. Kane opened the meeting, voice calm but tense. Miss Monroe, thank you for agreeing to meet with us immediately after your flight. As you know, there have been some recorded concerns about events that occurred in the first-class cabin today, and we would like to clarify those before proceeding with any further evaluations. Celeste didn't nod. She didn't smile. She maintained her steady gaze and replied, I didn't come here looking for an apology. I came to confirm whether you're ready to look at the evidence. No one replied. They didn't need to. Celeste slowly reached into her tote, pulled out a small black encrypted storage device, and placed it on the table before her. I'd like to present a short video, just 8 minutes, but enough for you to understand why the system you're operating is teetering on the edge of ethical collapse. Kane signaled the technician in the corner. Less than a minute later, a large LED screen at the back of the room lit up. Celeste picked up the remote and pressed play. No one in the room was prepared for what followed. The footage began with the first-class lounge at Northmark International. A black woman entering, pulling an old suitcase, being watched intently by staff, approached by security, asked to verify her identity without any stated technical reason. The visuals were sharp, the audio crisp. Connie Walden's voice rang clearly. You don't look like someone who usually travels first class. Cut to the ivory room. Celeste's voice rang cold. If you plan to escalate this into a legal matter, I'd like a lawyer present. A security officer fumbled, then stepped back. The video continued aboard the aircraft. Delaney ignoring Celeste, withholding service, offering no welcome. Smiling at Durant, pouring him wine, while deliberately turning away from the woman in 2A. Then came the order. We're going to need to reseat you to the rear cabin. Followed by Celeste's question. Then why am I the only one being asked to move? Short, precise. And in the conference room, the atmosphere froze. The video ended with no music, no captions. Only Celeste's eyes looking into the hidden camera, calm as though everything was still unfolding. The lights came back on. No one spoke for at least 10 seconds. Kane exhaled audibly. Sarah Monroe gripped her pen, her face pale. One of the FAA officials jotted down notes swiftly. Delaney sat nearly trembling. She couldn't look at anyone. Not Celeste, not her colleagues. Celeste leaned back in her chair. No pride, no smugness. She spoke softly. I didn't record this to shame anyone. I recorded it to prove one thing. Wrongdoing doesn't have to scream to be dangerous. Its danger lies in its silence and its repetition. Kane finally asked, Miss Monroe, may I ask in what capacity you recorded this footage? Celeste placed a sealed red wax envelope on the table, bearing the signature of Cypress Gate Capital's CEO. I am the Senior Director for Strategic Ethics Evaluation. Today's flight was part of a Level 3 covert audit under Clause 17 of our pre-disbursement agreement. Your airline has failed the benchmark. Kane closed his eyes. He knew what that meant. The name Celeste Monroe, unknown to most at first, was now revealed to be the final signatory on the $4.9 billion bailout package Skyreach had been depending on to stabilize its entire network. And now, with the evidence shown, that deal was at risk of being frozen indefinitely. The FAA began issuing formal directives, submission of full-service journey logs, internal response documentation, and customer service conduct pledges. Delaney was issued an immediate suspension from all international flights. Skyreach's HR department was ordered to audit all complaint history related to Connie Walden and the airport security team for the past 3 years. Celeste said nothing more. She stood, collected her materials, and said only one thing to Kane. If you won't act for the sake of your reputation, at least act for the sake of your dignity. When she walked out of that room, she didn't leave behind just a meeting. She left behind a moment where a corporation realized it isn't market share or stock price, but unchecked silence that burns a system from the inside out. Some empires don't collapse from gunfire, but from an 8-minute video. And some queens don't lose their thrones through rebellion, but through how they treated someone they assumed was nobody. When Celeste Monroe's footage was delivered to Cypress Gate Capital's headquarters, it wasn't just a verification file. It was an indictment, a quiet but thunderous document that shook the upper tiers of the U.S. aviation system. By Tuesday morning, just 18 hours after the closed-door meeting at Seattle Airport, Skyreach Airlines CEO Clifford Ames received an emergency case assessment from Cyprus's strategic response team. The first line of the report was bolded, Provisional Termination of Strategic Equity Agreement, Section 4.9 in breach. Within the hour, every regional board member and legal advisor was summoned, not by a scheduled meeting, but by a high-priority executive command. Clifford wasn't new to corporate survival. He'd rescued the airline from the 2020 financial crisis, brokered key trade agreements with 3 countries. But when he saw the name Celeste Monroe and the red signature attached to the file, he felt a chill down his spine. Because he knew, if Cyprus pulled out, the first ones to fall wouldn't be technicians or flight supervisors. It would be the people who sat in boardrooms, patted each other's backs, and said, "We've got this under control." They were wrong. At Skyreach headquarters, a nationwide emergency audit was launched. Every statement, report, and internal audio log from Flight 617 was reviewed. And at the center of this corporate earthquake, 2 names emerged, 2 queens of the old order. Connie Walden, head of the first-class lounge at Northmark International, and Delaney Walden, lead flight attendant of Flight 617. Sisters in function, if not in blood, long celebrated as the living decorum of Skyreach's luxury experience, now stood at the epicenter of a culture of subtle discrimination the airline had been denying for over a decade. That afternoon, Connie was summoned to HR. On the table were 6 letters of complaint from Black passengers over the past 3 years, all sharing the same pattern, being asked for ID while white passengers were not. Connie fumbled, then shifted to indignation. This is a security standard, but when asked why none of those reports bore supervisor signatures or timestamp documentation, She fell silent. She knew she had been watched for some time. It was only a matter of when. Delaney was grounded immediately. The suspension didn't come from within Skyreach, but from an independent investigative agency funded by Cyprus. They wanted to ensure that no individual involved would continue representing a brand under ethical review. Delaney didn't take it well. She called Durant to vent about corporate politics and that moralistic two-way passenger. But Durant, who had seen Celeste escorted out of the airport by FAA officials and senior liaison staff, was now worried for himself. He didn't answer. Delaney was beginning to feel something she had never tasted before: being ignored. Meanwhile, Celeste returned to Cyprus Gate Capital's Manhattan headquarters, not to conclude, but to begin the next phase. In her possession was more than just the video. She had an internal cultural audit of Skyreach, compiled covertly by the Ethics Intelligence Division across 22 regional hubs. A recurring pattern emerged: subtle but persistent discrimination, promotions driven by relationships rather than merit, and silence disguised as professionalism. She met with the chief legal officer and the vice president of strategic investments. They agreed on a decisive move to indefinitely freeze the $4.9 billion funding package. Not cancel, but suspend. And to unfreeze it, Skyreach would have to accept an unprecedented condition: appointing an independent chief culture officer, selected by Cyprus, with unrestricted access to monitor any operation within the airline without prior notice. The offer came with a single message: refusal of this condition will terminate all future negotiations. Clifford Ames received the proposal at 4:19 p.m. He didn't get angry. He simply picked up the phone and dialed Connie Walden's office. A cold voice on the other end: "She's no longer with us." Another call to Delaney: "This number is no longer in service." He understood. The game had shifted sides. The next morning, the Wall Street Journal ran the headline: "Cyprus freezes Skyreach deal over discrimination allegations. Two senior staff removed pending investigation." On social media, Celeste's video began circulating, first internally, then leaking outward. Not because she released it, but because someone inside the system, for the first time, couldn't stay silent anymore. Like dominoes, those who had long been dismissed, passengers, junior staff, interns, began sharing their own stories. An Asian American flight attendant mocked for her accent. A brown-skinned VIP customer downgraded to coach for convenience. Each small story a crack, and when they aligned, the wall crumbled. As for Connie and Delaney, two once untouchable queens, they now sat at the center of every ethics dashboard, every slide deck, every crisis training manual. Not because they were the root of the problem, but because they had become the most visible symbols of a system that refused to change. And when that system clashed with a woman who once sat in the cheapest seat on every flight she could afford, then no matter how gilded the throne, it could not save them from the fall. 1 week after Celeste Monroe's video leaked, no major media outlet dared to ignore the story. CNN ran it in prime time under the headline, "A Seat Denied, a System Exposed." MSNBC launched a special segment, "Invisible Until She Spoke." Even platforms once reserved for entertainment, like TikTok, turned the 8-minute clip into a national focal point, with the hashtag #MySeatForJustice surpassing 40 million views in just 72 hours. But amid the media storm, Celeste held on to something she had always protected throughout her career: purposeful silence. She gave no interviews, posted no defenses, made no stage appearances or public calls to action. She appeared only once, and not on television, but in a place no one would have expected: the Skyreach Airlines Training Center in Denver, Colorado. That morning, over 300 new hires were preparing for their first orientation session. No one knew who the black woman in the gray blouse standing quietly at the back of the room was. They assumed she was part of the consulting team, but when the regional manager walked in, recognized Celeste, and nearly dropped the attendance clipboard, the entire room shifted. Not because she showed up, but because they realized the system was changing. Celeste walked to the small stage. No microphone, no PowerPoint slides. She opened with a single sentence: "I'm not here to talk about ethics. I'm here to tell a story you'll never forget." And she told it. She told them about her first flight. At age 12, on a promotional fare, seat next to the restroom, no headrest, no water. She told them about being randomly selected for security screening 3 times in a row, just because of her high-bun hairstyle. She told them about the day she received her first email from Cypress Gate Capital and thought it was a scam, because no one imagined that a woman who had worked night shifts at a diner could ever become a strategic evaluator for a $25 billion investment fund. The room fell silent. The new employees, white, Asian, Latinx, took no notes. They just watched. Because Celeste's voice wasn't lecturing. It was simply telling. But each sentence, each story, carved at the invisible wall they'd never dared to name. Then she asked, "How many of you have seen a passenger treated unfairly but didn't know what to do?" More than half raised their hands. "How many of you have heard a colleague say something inappropriate but stayed silent because you feared being judged?" The entire room, she smiled, not in triumph, but in recognition, because she confirmed something. Silence isn't malice. It's a consequence, and that consequence can change if someone dares to break it. At the end, she offered no slogans, no stand up and fight. She simply said, "Next time you see someone who didn't get water, don't wait for a supervisor. Just ask what they need." A sentence that might sound ordinary, but in the service industry, sometimes a glass of water is the line between dignity and humiliation. The session ended, but the story didn't. One trainee, Maria Tenorio, 26, originally from Honduras, posted a short clip filmed from behind Celeste on Twitter with the caption, "Today I saw leadership that didn't need a title." Within 24 hours, the post reached 2.7 million views and over 400,000 shares. A new wave ignited, not of outrage, but of learning. For the first time, Skyreach wasn't just an airline. It was the national stage on how to make things right. CEO Clifford Ames understood that without deep action, everything else was just cosmetic. He sent Celeste an official offer. "I want you to be the independent chief culture officer, not reporting to me, not to the board, but directly to our customers and employees." Celeste didn't answer immediately. She replied with a question. "If I find 17 supervisors that need replacing, what would you do?" Clifford responded, "I'll start looking for replacements the next morning." 3 days later, Celeste accepted. The day she entered her new office, a room with no glass walls, no plaques of honor, just a simple desk. She brought only one item, the first-class seat from Flight 617, now installed as a display. Not to memorialize pain, but to remind everyone, a seat without justice is just decorative entrapment. She made no 100-day plans, held no press conferences. She simply traveled, from branch to branch, as a quiet observer. But this time, no one ignored her, because everyone knew that voice, once spoken, wasn't here to intimidate. It was here to open spaces that had long been locked shut. That was when the system began to shift, and that's how the wall was broken. Not by rage, but by a calm voice. A voice that didn't represent power. It represented what was right. 5 weeks after Celeste Monroe officially took on the role of independent chief culture officer at Skyreach Airlines, the first signs of change began to appear. Not on promotional posters, but in places no one had paid attention to before. Employee lounges, shift assignment boards, internal evaluation forms. Then on day 36, an email was sent from an internal account named c.monroe at skyreachleadership.org with a subject line that was neither fancy nor sensational, just plain and simple. "For the record, a letter to the system." The content of the letter spanned more than 1,900 words, without using PR jargon, without formatting like a report. It was a narration, but not a lament. It was an indictment, but without accusations. It was a declaration, but didn't need a signature with a title, because the writer no longer needed a business card to speak the truth. Celeste began the letter as follows. "I used to think the system was something distant. It was the top floor offices, the Excel sheets where people I'd never met decided my fate. But it turns out the system isn't far at all. It lives in how a person is called by name or passed over, in how a joke gets a laugh or gets ignored, in how we choose to look past someone, just because they don't look like the kind of person we were taught is deserving. And then she recounted her own experience about Flight 617, about the first class lounge, about the frown from a flight attendant, and the moment she realized this wasn't an accident, it was a model so deeply ingrained it could no longer be called a mistake. She didn't write the letter to complain. She wrote it so the system could reflect on itself. And that was what gave the letter its power. It didn't attack, but it made no compromises. The middle section of the letter, widely shared among employees, was quoted verbatim. If you've ever witnessed injustice and thought, I don't have the power to change that, you've been too well trained by the system. If you've ever felt discomfort when someone names a problem, but not when the problem itself exists, you are preserving what's called stability, not justice. I know, because I used to be the same. Celeste didn't write just for senior management. She wrote for the person cleaning the cockpit, for the baggage handler at the destination gate, for the call center agent listening to an angry customer who lost their bag and received no help because they didn't speak fluent English. She wrote for the entire chain of invisible people, to let them know someone sees them, not only when they make mistakes, but when they silently endure. The ending of the letter wasn't a conclusion, it was a beginning. Celeste wrote, I don't expect everyone to change overnight, but I do expect us to begin, not through workshops, but through small actions. Greet someone you once thought was unimportant. Listen to a voice you once assumed was weak. Ask a simple question, how can I help? Before making any judgment. Just 12 hours after the letter was sent, SkyReach's internal email system recorded over 37,000 opens, with a full read rate of over 92%, a number never seen in any previous internal communication campaign. The first comments started to appear on the feedback system, from technical staff, administrative workers, even pilots. And notably, an anonymous message came from a longtime operator at the Northmark Lounge, where the whole story began, stating, I used to think I was part of a successful system, but I never considered measuring success by fairness. The letter didn't just stir the internal community, it spread outward. A leaked copy surfaced on LinkedIn and was shared by hundreds of aviation professionals, from competitors to former employees. A ripple effect began. 3 other airlines announced they would appoint independent chief culture officers, not because they were forced to, but because if they didn't change, they would no longer have a place in the hearts of the public. At an industry conference held in Atlanta 2 weeks later, Celeste was invited to speak but declined. Instead, she sent that same letter in printed form, no logo, no branding, for attendees to read and decide for themselves what was worth remembering. One attendee, the chief human resources officer of a major airline, read the letter and wrote on the public comment board at the conference, we were just retaught what credibility means, by a woman who holds no formal title of power. And that's exactly right. Celeste didn't need a round table to negotiate, didn't need pressure to push change. Her letter, by its own merit, became the first knock on the iron gate that had long kept justice outside this industry. And in SkyReach's 17-year history, there had never been a single document, not a financial report, not a strategic memo, that had been printed out, pinned to internal bulletin boards and referred to as the first letter we ever sent to ourselves. 3 months after Celeste Monroe's letter shook the airline industry, nothing was the same anymore. Not just at SkyReach Airlines, but even at Northmark International, the birthplace of the storm, the place where she had once been asked to leave the lounge simply because she didn't look like someone who belonged there. The people who had once looked past her, once deemed her unimportant, now could no longer forget her name. Not because she forced them to remember, but because the very system they had blindly served had changed within them, little by little, like water slowly filling a silent glass. On a Monday morning in March, Northmark held an unprecedented event, the grand reopening of the first-class lounge, following what was described as a comprehensive overhaul of service policies, personnel, and operational design based on lived customer experiences. The media called it a symbolic PR event. But to over 200 employees working there, it was an acknowledgement of something they had never dared to admit before, that someone had once been dismissed because of their appearance, and they had stood by in silence. The new nameplate for the area was cast in engraved bronze, with no corporate logo. Just one simple inscription: the Monroe Lounge, dedicated to those who were once dismissed but never forgotten. Celeste was invited but, as usual, didn't respond to the invitation. The organizers considered canceling the ceremony, but on the very day of the reopening, a woman in a black blouse, wearing flats and without any security detail, stepped out of a silver pickup truck and walked straight into the airport. No cameras, no reporters. But everyone recognized her. This time, not because someone whispered her name behind her back, but because her name was engraved on the very wall they once tried to ignore. Celeste gave no speech. She didn't cut a ribbon. She simply walked down the corridor, nodding at each employee, even the ones who had once turned their backs on her. And then she stopped at a seat by the window, the very place where she had been asked to leave 3 months prior. No one told her where to go. No one asked for ID. They simply stood at a distance and watched her sit down, this time not because she was tired, but because she had become a symbol that could no longer be denied. The silence in the hall wasn't out of fear. It was because everyone understood. There are moments when just being present is a statement, and Celeste made that statement in the most unexpected way. Not through power, not through vengeance, not through accusations, but through the presence of someone who had once been erased and was now written back into the very system that tried to forget her. Right after the ceremony, a young beverage server named Elijah approached her, hands slightly trembling, and asked, "Ms. Monroe, I've heard your story since my first day working here. I just want to ask, do you think the system has really changed?" Celeste looked at him for a moment, then smiled, not because the question was amusing, but because it was the very thing she had once asked herself at age 18 when she submitted her first job application to an airline and was rejected without explanation. She replied, "It hasn't completely changed. But when a beverage server dares to ask that question in a place that once forced me into silence, then I believe it has begun." Elijah nodded, eyes slightly misty, then stepped back, not wanting to interrupt the moment. And as Celeste stood up and walked out of the newly inaugurated lounge, the manager, Connie Walden, the one who had signed the order to remove her from the terminal 3 months before, quietly approached. No excuses, no tearful apology, just a steady gaze, and a thin white envelope placed into Celeste's hand. She didn't open it immediately, but when seated on her flight back to New York, this time in economy class, she finally did. Inside was a handwritten note card. "You taught me that justice doesn't always need a megaphone. Sometimes it just needs someone who refuses to disappear. I will not forget again. Connie." The plane that carried Celeste away from Denver that day had no celebratory music, no wine service, no thank you from the crew. But as it took off, a stranger seated beside her, a middle-aged Korean man, turned and asked, "Are you the Celeste Monroe?" She nodded gently. He smiled, nodded back. "My daughter is writing an essay about you in her civics class." Celeste smiled, not out of politeness this time, but because she knew her actions, though small, had opened a space for others to enter, and no longer be pushed out just because they didn't look like what the system was used to. When the plane landed, the man stood up first, picking up her luggage for her. Not because she was famous, but because, for the first time, a stranger remembered her as someone who had taught them how to look inward. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about this story isn't that a woman who was once kicked out of a first-class lounge came back and had that very place named after her. It's not the shiny bronze plaque or the news articles written about her. It's the fact that an ordinary person, without power, without a megaphone, could still make an entire system remember her name. Not because she shouted, but because she refused to disappear. And perhaps the saddest part is that this story isn't just about Celeste. It's happening every day, at front desks, in glances that pass over people, in seats reserved for those who look the part. But if one woman could change the entire airline industry with nothing but quiet resolve, then we, the people watching this video, can change the world too, one small action at a time. If you've made it this far, there's probably a feeling inside you, joy that justice was restored, anger that injustice still exists, or simply admiration for a woman who refused to be silent? Leave us a comment below. What do you think needs to change in the way society judges people? And don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this about kindness, dignity, and the kind of plot twists that leave the world speechless. Because when you hit follow, you're not just supporting a video, you're helping spread a message that matters. Thank you for watching.